Good evening, folks. Waju and Dinaway Magadog. Nishkonong Disnakas, Wabajashi Dodem, Amjanong Dunjaba, Nishnabe, meanwhile, Bodoad meaning Dao. Chimigwech for logging on. I'm just going to kind of give my rundown of things before we start. And hopefully that gives a few seconds for people to log in and they can listen as well. My name is Dallas Sinapol. For those that don't know me, my position for the board is the Indigenous lead, and I like to set up teacher PD and resources and all those kind of fun things. So that leads us to kind of why we got into this webinar series, is because that with Indigenous education, there's like a lot of different things that happen that people don't see, and there's a lot of reasoning why our students and success doesn't match the main system nowadays, and it's something that we're working on, and it's a slow process, and so we wanted to give all you educators, show you from our view as Indigenous people what we see and how we want to help our students, so that you can see through our lens as well, and how you can help our Indigenous students. So that's it in a nutshell. I want to say thanks to all the attendees, all you teachers and administrators and superintendents that get in on the call. We really appreciate you guys coming in and learning what we have to offer. And I also want to give thanks to Chief Jason Henry. Chief is one of my relatives from my father's community, and I really I look up to Chief Henry and all the stuff that he does with his community. I also call that my community too, because that's where my father's from. I'm still attached there, and so I really want to say miigwech, Jason, for being on the call. And tonight we're talking about the culture shock for students that leave a reserve school, if you will, for lack of better words, and move on to a provincial school, and kind of what that is like. But you can also dive into whatever else that you need to, Jason. We got a whole hour to talk, and we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So a little bit of housekeeping. If I'm not sure when Rod's going to open that up, but I think you can ask your questions in there, and closer to the end of the presentation, we'll address those questions. So far, so I'll pass this on to you, Chief, and take her away. And I hope you're. Are you almost home? Are you on to another? All right, take her away.
Okay, miigwech, Dallas, bonjour, Kinawia, Bijikiniba Wed Indigenous Cause, Mong Indodem, Kikonong, Ajodena and Donjaba, Ojibwe, Odawadami, Odawa, Anish Indao, Jaganashim Indao, Minoa Ogima Indao, Shaganashima Jina. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for logging in. To excuse my background, I'm just traveling back from a pediatrician's appointment with my great nephew. So I've been asked today to speak about the culture shock around, of Indigenous students attending a provincial school system. So I first want to explain a bit about myself and who my family is. My Anishinaabe name is Bijiki Nibawid, and that means that I stand like a buffalo. And in our culture and in our teachings, the buffalo is the one that stands for our identity and our teachings and protects the river of life, protects this Anishinaabe way of being. And I take that very seriously, that responsibility, and I do my best, and I've done my best for a long time to try and learn and gather knowledge, for myself and for my family. And I've lived this way pretty well my entire life. Started my pursuit for Indigenous knowledge, for my identity and my culture and my language, my spirituality, since I was a young child, around age of 9 or 10 years old. And my wife, her name is Nitue Gaboikwe. That means that she stands ahead in the way that she leads. And she's a Sturgeon clan. And her too, she spent her entire life looking for this way of life, searching, learning, and earning these teachings. I have 3 children. My oldest son, his name is Manado Giwazans. It means that he's a spirit boy. And I have another son. His name is Zawa Maingdons, which means yellow wolf. His birth certificate name is Zibuan, which means river. And I have my daughter, my youngest child. Her name is Benesikwe, and that is her Anishinaabe name, and that is her birth certificate name. And I bring them with me in a lot of my teaching sessions, and I use my family as part of my presentation and my instruction as to who we are. And I'm from the Loon clan, and my 2 youngest children as well are Loon clan, but my oldest son, he's my adopted son. He's from the Bear clan, and as I mentioned, my wife's from the Sturgeon clan, and that is very important for us as Indigenous people that are working on reclamation of our identity, to understand our governance, our clan, our community, and social roles, through that clan structure. And in our teachings, the Anishinaabe teachings that we live by, my family, it's a patrilineal passing of the clan. So my youngest children, as I mentioned, they're my biological children. They carry the Loon clan as well, and we have roles and responsibilities through that. I just want to take a minute to talk about my kids' names. Ethan Monroe Giwazans is how I introduced him earlier, because that's his spirit name. His real name, his true identity. His name is Ethan on his birth certificate. And then Zibawan. And when Zibawan was born, my wife and I were 21 years old. And we had a lot of debate about whether or not that we should give Zibawan a name in the Ojibwe language. And it's important to think about that for me as an Indigenous parent and as an Indigenous person, that at that point in time, even my wife and I that had spent, the majority of our lives living in Anishinaabe, possessing our name, our clan, our identity, being, language learners and working hard to achieve this identity of ourselves, we debated whether to name our child in Ojibwe and put that on his birth certificate. And that was a struggle, because we were cautious then, even though we were so dedicated to that learning and this way of life, we were still cautious at that point in time, knowing our own experience as Indigenous people growing up, that maybe he wouldn't be accepted, or maybe he'd be criticized or made fun of based on his name. And, granted that the occasional hockey tournament or things like that, his name was fumbled and things like that, or they just say, Mr. Henry, if they announced him for an award or MVP. That was a struggle that we had. By the time our daughter was born, Benesikwe, we were 26, and in that short period of time of growth and knowledge and learning and acceptance of our son and his carrying of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe name, just the name that we gave him, not even his spirit name on his birth certificate, we knew that it was okay for our daughter's given birth certificate, government name to be her Anishinaabe name, and that is her identity. And that's identity that she carries, and she carries proudly. And in the school system, she struggles with that, and it's upsetting for her, and it's troubling for her, because teachers constantly make an attempt to try and anglicize her name. Can we call you Nancy or Nancy? And they try and take away the pronunciation of her name. And her name is of great significance to her, to our teachings, and to our family. And Benesikwe means Thunderbird Woman. And through all of her family lines, Benasikwe is a name that many of her grandmothers have carried. And it's very significant in our teachings, her name. And she carries that name with great pride and great strength and great fortitude. That she carries that identity for our people. And I see great promise in our young people that are reclaiming their true identity. And I just want to highlight that for a moment, that even that part for us as Indigenous people that are very upfront with our identity and understand that still was a struggle for my wife and I in naming our children. And we are of Anishinaabe identity. Although we are of mixed descendancy, we have Anishinaabe blood. And I stated that in my introduction, that I am Ojibwe, that I am Potawatomi, that I am Odawa, and I am Shaganash. And what that means is that my sort of tribal affiliation, one might say, I say it's more of my linguistic association, that I'm associated with the Anishinaabe people that speak Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa, which are all part of the Three Fires Confederacy. And I am also a descendant of an English-speaking nation, which is English and Irish. Jaganash means an English-speaking person. I have my wife's lineage. She has some Wemtagojin. She has French-speaking lineage, and she would identify like that she's Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Wemtagojin. So it's important to understand our identity. But that's me and my family, and we've worked a long time to regain, to reclaim, and possess that identity. And that takes a lot of work. For a person to be able to do that, they have to have broken at least some of the cycles of the intergenerational trauma that have been placed upon Indigenous people as a result of the colonization process and the systemic stripping of our identity. The colonization process, it's been going on for a long time, and it's rooted in the doctrine of terra nullius. That is sort of the discovery doctrine that brought people to this continent, and that's from the 1400s. And people arrived here armed with the doctrine of terra nullius. And the doctrine of terra nullius was a palpable bull. And the doctrine of terra nullius puts in place certain principles, and that principle or doctrine is that if any territory is discovered uninhabited by Christian people, then the land is determined to be uninhabited. And it's important to think about that. So as people arrive here in this part of the land and they find the Indigenous people, and as I stated in my opening and my sort of beginning part of the conversation, we have an identity, and we have governance, and we have this belief system. But along comes a group of people that are armed, by the Catholic Church with this palpable bull, the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of terra nullius, that says, hey, if they're not Christian, the land's there to be taken. And that's how the relationship begins. It begins in this sort of paternalistic role where you're over there and you're discovering these other people that they're not like you, they're less than, just go ahead and take their land. And that was the formation, the foundation of our relationship between people that arrived here on this continent and the original inhabitants. And that begins to form things. And that relationship goes on for a long period of time. And we haven't totally, come to terms with that. And even the understanding about that for Canadians, for Americans, for people on this continent is still forming. The thought and understanding that the basis of our relationship and our partnerships is founded on that doctrine. And to date, the Catholic Church has not removed the doctrine of terra nullius. That is still there. So they've refused to repeal that so far. That's important to think about as how our relationship begins. And then as we go on, we get into this mode of the removal of the identity of the people that are here through various means. And eventually on comes the Indian Act. Following the Royal Proclamation, along comes the Indian Act. And I just wanted to take a moment to mention a part about our communities here that are in this area of Land County. And as the Indian Act is being formed, and as the land cessation treaties are happening in the area, and some of you may have read in the news recently about the Clench Defalcation Settlement, which was, a settlement from the Canadian government to jointly to the Chippewas of Stony Point First Nation and the Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And what's important about that is that took place, prior to the Indian Act. And on that time, there was a lot of these land grabs that were going on. and there was a struggle. And to negotiate the taking of land, it took a long period of time. And eventually, it gets to the point that they're struggling very hard to take land. And they determine that it's because of our strength and our resilience and our pre-existing identity. So they have to try and find a way to break that down. And there's many references to this nowadays. And also, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We know a lot more about the Indian residential schools. And what's interesting is during the time of this Clench defalcation, when they're struggling to try and take the land from what was then called the Sarnia Indian Band, which consisted of at the time of the Clench defalcation of the Chippewas of Sarnia and the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point, they were struggling greatly to try and take the land. And there's this correspondence that goes back between Colonel Clench, who was an Indian agent here locally, and between Sir Duncan Campbell Scott. There's this conversation that goes forth. And in the correspondence going back and forth in our research around the Clench defalcation, we learned that they started having formative thoughts then, the creation of residential schools. And it's interesting and I think it's significant for us here in this area, in the Lambton County area, that some of those formative thoughts from an Indian agent here began to happen. So eventually we get to the Indian residential school. And this is where I want to begin leaning more into the culture shock with some formation of how it got to that point. So the residential schools come in with a purpose and an intent. And it's referenced many different ways and it's described many different ways. But essentially, I think one of the most impactful statements that they made was the objective was to strip the Indian from the child. And I consider myself to be a second generation residential school survivor. My grandfather attended and I never ever want to take away from what those people at the Indian residential school was brutal. And I rehash that today, but it was very bad. And what it does though is it strips away identity. And as educators, I'm sure you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It stripped children away from their parents and their grandparents. They lost love, they lost stability, they lost identity, they lost their shelter. They lost the base of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what that does is it makes it difficult for children and they're learning that is sort of, and there are actual accounts of that type of thing going on. Children are not being parented by their parents. They're not being loved by their parents. And parents in turn are not able to pass that on, and grandparents in turn aren't able to pass that on. So we lose a connection, and education becomes a very negative thing. And what I've described so far in my opening and in I build up about the residential school and the systemic stripping of identity is a systemic problem. And I always encourage educators can do. That if it's through education or whether it's through so on, you are part of the system. I'm getting intermittent choppiness.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pause for 1 second and try.
Yeah, let's do that. Good idea.
Jason, if you were, did we lose him?
He's just going to try it and get a different connection.
Oh yeah. I was gonna say, Jason, if you're down the hill, you might have to drive up the hill and park at the plaza. You'll have a better connection.
Okay, how's my connection now? How's my connection now?
The audio sounds
better.
Audio sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. I've arrived home. So the point that I was getting at is that we've taken this from ourselves, and it's been taken away from us by the system, and there's an impression that the system is what it is, and we're still struggling to come to terms with that. And as educators, unfortunately, and even myself as an Indian Act chief, I too am part of the system, and that's how I'm seen. The system, and it's true, because I'm elected through the Indian Act, and I'm enacting part of the Indian Act as through that electoral system. And it's a very difficult position to be in, yourself as educators, myself as an elected member, and other members of the system. We're perceived as being part of that system because we are. So here we are, trying to do our best. And I take it by the fact that you're sitting in this session today, that you want to understand more, achieve more, and do more, and be at a better position to educate Indigenous children. And I'm very thankful for that. But it's important to understand where we're at. So before I mentioned about the systemic piece, I was talking about the fact that we've disrupted the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that we're struggling. And I mentioned my grandfather and other people that went directly to the school. I'm of the opinion that there was a purpose and an intent for residential schools, and it had a very direct impact on the children that went there. And I don't doubt that. I know from the way my grandfather lived following residential school, and other people that I know are survivors have lived, that it was very difficult to be there. But they were stripped of something, and those were the skills of being a parent. A lot of that was stripped away. And there's an argument of nature versus nurture. And I think that it goes, I'm not opinion of which actually is predominant, but I think both of it plays a role in how children end up being raised. And I know that, and this is very transparent, that many people that went there have a hard time parenting their children in a way that's actually culturally acceptable to Indigenous people prior to residential schools. That there's a lot of physical abuse, there's a lot of emotional abuse, there's a lot of other abuses that I don't think I need to discuss, but I think that your imaginations can take you there quickly. And that is what happened to the people that were there. And then they in turn pass that on, and we become our oppressor. And I really believe, truly, as a second generation survivor, that the real impact is happening today. And I don't think that only Indigenous people have social issues. I don't think that only Indigenous people have abuse issues or alcohol issues or drug issues. But I think that when you look at the psychology of a human being, and when you take away those base needs of a person to be able to succeed and be successful, when you take that away, each and every day becomes a struggle. When your parents have not been given the skills to be able to care for you as you fully need, when you're not sure of what your identity is. And I remember when I was a young person, I used to make a joke, because I'm part Indigenous and part non-Indigenous. I'd make a joke that one half of me hated the other half of me. And that was, for me, that was a bit of my coping mechanism, was humor. And if you teach Indigenous students, I know you see Indigenous humor. And I'll be very clear, that is a coping mechanism. And I use it myself. Because what else can you do? but try and find ways to cope. I made this joke about hating myself. My Indian half hates my non-Indian half. And that was partially a joke, but it's a struggle that people go through in being of mixed ascendancy in Indigenous communities, not being fully accepted by the community that you live in and that you're from, and not being fully accepted in the schools that you go to and the other organizations around you. And that's a real struggle. But beyond that, that is only because that each and every one of us that have that impact of residential schools have that struggle with identity ourselves. And when you question your own identity and your own worth and value as a community member and as a person and a family member, then you tend to lash out in lateral violence and bullying. And that happens in the home, and it happens in the community, and it happens in the school. And then by the time you're entering the public school system, you're not sure if you're getting food today. You're not sure if you're going to get, heard at home. And I'm not saying that every single house is like this. Everyone is trying. Everyone is trying to do better each and every day. But when you're not sure about this as a student, and I know students struggle, and I do my best to advocate for kids to have everything they need. Watch from, and it's a fight. And you're stepping back into the system that you've been told is out to work against you. And it is hard. It is so difficult for children to have to go through that. It's hard for any adolescent, for any teenager, for any person, even in their 20s, trying to go to post-secondary right now. It is hard in 2021 to be educated. It's a struggle. And if you look across the entire continent, how many children are using Xanax and Ativan and Adderall and those kind of drugs? And that's just mainstream. And then you take a step back and look at Indigenous children and what they've gone through, and that, some people are able to begin that healing journey, to stop the cycles and begin moving forward. But many aren't. Many have so many determinants that are against them, and poverty is a major issue. And when you put that in there with all of the other struggles that learners have in today's day and age, it is nearly impossible to be successful. When even like on your best day, you're not sure if you're accepted in society. You're not sure if you're accepted in your family. And it's a struggle. And I don't want to be doom and gloom. And I don't want to make this whole presentation about trauma. But I just want to be very clear that our children do have an uphill battle. And not all of them, but many do. And some of those that don't have that struggle, but still want to fit in, end up falling into that groove as well. So I mentioned that I bring my children with me everywhere I go in presentations, and that's true. I just want to take a moment to talk about, we could pause from that and talk about my son, Zebuwan. Zebuwan is an excellent hockey player, and loved to play hockey. And there was an instance during a playoff game where something had transpired, and he upset the other team and their players, and they decided to call him Featherhead. And you know what I mean? It didn't seem that bad, maybe, but I didn't even catch it. So it happened on the ice, and we're in a playoff game, and he had a couple of goals already, and he comes off the ice and he's crying. And at the time, I don't know if he had quite turned 18 yet. Maybe he was 18. Comes off the ice crying. And he's got a couple of goals notched and things are going well. And he comes off and he's crying and he goes in the dressing room. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe, like, what happened? Did you get hurt? Somebody spear you? Like, what happened? Why are you crying? And I what's going on, man? And he's like, oh, they called me a featherhead. And it broke him. And I still haven't quite totally understood why it broke him that day. Right? A child that bears an Indigenous name, a child that has a family that isn't totally healed. I'm not trying to claim that my family is totally healed, but we are working through that. We understand the trauma. We can recognize it. We're moving through the healing process. Every day, you have to relook at things and make sure that you're advancing, moving forward. So here's this child that's raised, and I believe that my family is above the poverty line. And we have my kids in sports. We offer them lots of great opportunities. And here's this kid at 18, 17 or 18 years old, that one comment hit him so hard at a sports game that he left the ice crying. He's the at the time. I have no idea what those things. I really don't. I know that I've given my kids every opportunity that I possibly could. And I know other kids that don't have the same opportunities as my children. I can only imagine what they must go through. And I know that I'm not sure who's all on the call who's hearing this or seeing this. I've been in some of your classrooms probably. I've spoke other times when some of these instances come up and there's racism. And I try and advocate very heavily for the struggles that our children go through. And those are real. I can't claim to know what the kids are going through. I really can't. I know what I experience and I see what my kids experience. I know that the education system is doing its best. And the fact that we're having this session today tells me that we're making steps forward. The fact that Dallas is working with you guys and helping, and I've seen your presenters list, it seems excellent. And I know that your presentations are all laced with trauma, much of them about the trauma that Indigenous people have endured. I think that's important that you begin to understand that and begin to understand where Indigenous students are coming from. My wife had a position with the school board some years ago. She was the Native Student Counselor at Northampton. And she shared with me some of the stuff that she used to do, which wasn't, I don't think you guys paid her to do this, and she probably wasn't supposed to do it. But when kids wouldn't show up to class after lunch, she'd travel down to the yoke. And those NLSS teachers know what the yoke is. She'd go down to the yoke and she'd go in there and she'd grab the kids by the ear and drag them out and say, get back to class right now. She'd go back to tracks where they're smoking up and she'd find them and drag them back to the school, back into class. Because sometimes that kind of tough love is the love that our kids need, because they're not necessarily getting that all the time. And I think that she did a good job at that, because kids need that extreme sometimes, where someone's going to step outside of their comfort zone and make them uncomfortable and say, you shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be skipping school and drinking right now. You shouldn't be skipping school and taking drugs right now. Why are you doing this? And I'm not saying that and that's because that's the role and relationship she had with them. She was like an aunt or a mother or, in that scenario. And she had earned that respect of those children. I had the opportunity yesterday afternoon to drive one of my wife's former students to a treatment center, a young person, barely out of school age, I would say, called me on Thursday morning. And I think it's important that you guys hear this. Called me on Thursday morning at 6 o'clock in the morning and said didn't believe that they would survive the end of another week if they didn't get in the treatment because of the alcohol and the drugs and the abuse. Felt that the system had failed them and was scared for their life. I was very successful, fortunate. I was very fortunate to be able to actually get this person to a treatment center. And I stuck with them over the weekend through communication, and my wife and I managed to drive them to the treatment center ourselves last evening. And we had a bit of a dialogue, and it was a 3-hour car ride to the treatment center. We had a bit of time to talk with them, and my wife still maintains that relationship. And the person was afraid. My wife said, if you run, I'm going to do just like I did to you in high school. I'm going to chase you down. I'm going to grab you by your ear. I'm going to drag you back to that treatment center, because you can do this. People care about you. We're rooting for you, and you can be successful. And this person went. They went into the treatment center. They're there for about 40 or 50 days. And that's based on partially my relationship with some of the community members, not all of them, but some of them, and my wife's relationship with the students that she had when she was at North Lambton. And I think it's important to recognize that as educators, the residential school system, the education system, we'll call it, took many things away. And the education system also has the power to bring those things back. And not that any outside organization should ever be responsible for replacing culture or identity, but certainly you can help empower our children to relearn their culture and identity. And my family and I, we have taken the path and the chosen to fully engage in that cultural, spiritual language revitalization. But cultural reclamation or revitalization does not have to be spiritual. One can lend to the other very easily. But what is the culture of a community? I know I speak often about the fact that as Great Lakes communities, we're fisher people in culture. And if I say fisherman, or if I use the male reference anytime, it's because I'm a man, and I'm identify as he, him, and I'm male centric. So excuse me if I say fishermen, but fisher people. We have a lot of great fisher women in our community as well. But we are a community of fishermen and fisher people, and that's part of our culture. We're of the Great Lakes culture, and we struggle to identify with that because we've been so far stripped away from that. Our identity has been taken so far away from us. And that's what you have to be able to appreciate with our kids, is that when they're walking into your classroom, they're trying to relearn their identity. And I'm oftentimes I become envious of some other cultures when I see them so well steeped in their culture. And I'll give an example. I attended North Lambton. My kids, they attend St. Patrick's Catholic High School, but I attended North Lambton, and North Lambton, of course, is very close to Arkona and the surrounding community, and there's a lot of Dutch members in Arkona. It's, as far as I understand, it's more or less a Dutch settlement. And I remember having a lot of friends and peers in high school, and I was so proud of them for calling their grandparents Oma and Opa. Right. And I remember feeling sad for myself that I wasn't even okay using Mishomis or Nokomis for my grandma and grandpa. I was so proud of them that even at school they used that. I'm going to my Omas, my Opas, and they're connected to that culture in ways that even us as Indigenous people, the original inhabitants here, weren't even comfortable with. And that hurt. And it still hurts today. It hurts me today to sometimes see other people more engaged in their language and culture and identity as an adult. As a person who I think that at times I reach self-actualization and I'm doing very well in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that I have all those things to be a successful human being. Even today, I still struggle with identity. And people need to be cognizant of that children are unstable coming from our communities, and need to be appreciative of that. I know that some of our students choose not to stand for O Canada, and my daughter chose not to stand for O Canada when she was little. I think she was 10 years old. Anyway, she called me from the office and she said, "Dad, I need to know why I'm not standing for O Canada." And I said, "Well, I don't know. Like, why did you choose not to?" "Well, Canada doesn't stand for me." That's what she said. I'm like, "Well, you need to tell your principal that, because you're in the office now for not standing for Canada. I didn't tell you not to stand. You made that choice. You made that choice not to stand for Canada. You chose to make a stand today. So why did you make that choice?" And she had to work through that choice of why she did that. And she had to be willing to stand for her voice. My daughter, again, 14 years old, struggles today with the territorial acknowledgements and the bastardization of our Indigenous names, even just Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe. She struggles with that, let alone any and every other part of the territorial acknowledgement. My daughter has a much stronger voice than I do, and she does presentations like this, probably much more heartfelt and much more direct. She delivers presentations on Indigenous education and the effects on students. And if she wasn't busy right now helping with my great nephew, I'd ask her to share some words as well. But she's still feeling the impacts today of that. So those are some of the direct struggles that I can speak to right now. The culture shock, so to speak. I wanted to speak about Hillside School, and that's the school in Kettle Point that services the community here, and then ends up being a feeder school for the Lambton Kent District School Board, one of the feeder schools. You know, some of the stuff that I've discussed today with you, we couldn't discuss at Hillside. We have a hard time even discussing, language and culture and identity, mostly because we're still at odds with ourselves about that, because we're still so hurt by residential schools. At the Hillside School, I know many students struggle. I had a conversation with the principal about 3 years ago about the high needs students, the students that take more attention have higher needs than others, and what the ratio is. And the principal took time to explain to me that in many schools, it can be as high as 30% of any classroom of students that have special or high needs. And I said, okay, well, what's the ratio at Hillside? She said, well, it's exactly inverted. About 70% of every classroom has special and high needs students. And I said, well, how do you function? Like, how do you do that? Well, it's a struggle. It's a struggle to meet all the needs of the 30% that aren't high needs, because much of the time is spent by the teachers addressing those specific needs of the special needs students. Our attendance rates are lower. And I know that our school reopened last week at Hillside, and they closed again because COVID numbers increased again. The school opened. Our average attendance rate is about 70% on a good day. Attendance rates last week were at 90%, so a very good attendance turnout because students are missing turnout for a few days last week. The school was open to succeed and aren't hindered with special needs, are also then become hindered with education needs being met at the school. And then when they enter, so the secondary school, then they have this catch-up game to play. I recall when when all of my kids entered high school, they had a great struggle to catch up and get on stride. Presently, my daughter is using Sylvan Learning to fill in the gaps where needed, because she's beneath grade level on certain subjects. And again, we've had tutors and we've done all those things with our kids the best we can to help them out. But still, even with that and with all the resources we were able to provide to them, we're still at the point of struggling to catch up when they enter in high school. So that's some of the struggles and some of the culture shock and the uphill battle that our kids have on any given day. We got about 15 minutes left. I want to pause there for questions and answers.
That's a great idea. Thanks, Chief. And so many great words that you've shared with us. A lot of things that most would not have ever heard. And it's we think that it's kind of shocking because it should be information that should be shared on a daily basis, in schools throughout every grade, really, essentially. But we just don't. Over the past years, it's you turn to the Indigenous section and something that you just aren't comfortable teaching, you would flip past it really fast and move on. right? So, so I'm just gonna look for in our chat. So yeah, so I really want to, say that was all really, really good questions. Is there anybody in the chat, at all our educators out there? I'm sure there's got to be some sort of questions. Remember, folks, that as we teach our students, there are no bad questions. So if there's anything that you guys could think of for Chief Henry, you have not only an Indigenous person in front of you, you have an educated Indigenous Ogima chief in front of you. So I encourage you to ask any questions if you want, and now would be the proper time to go through that. And if not, then I like to talk, so I can ask a few questions as well. So I'll keep the chat open and see if we can go from there. But I encourage you all. Deborah Stewartson says, I'm wondering how we can do better with the land acknowledgement. That's a great question.
Yeah, so my daughter's behalf, I wrote a land acknowledgement that I was appropriate. And I'll read it. I'll read it out. I'm just going to find it here. This is one that I felt was appropriate. Acknowledge the earth, our mother, the provider of all that is required to sustain physical life here upon this planet. We acknowledge that this place on earth has been here since before our creation as humankind, and that all beings that live on this planet are our elders upon this earth. We acknowledge that all living things on the earth, in the water, and in the air are our relatives and our equals. We acknowledge that we all have the responsibility to protect and preserve the earth. We, as the youngest visitors here upon the earth, must ensure that the earth is here for the future generations of all beings that live upon her. We acknowledge that this territory in particular has been inhabited by the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe, represented by various linguistic groups, have made their home and sounded their voices here for time immemorial. The Anishinaabe have protected and shared this territory with other original nations that have inhabited this continent since time immemorial. The share of territory was defined by many pre-European contact treaties that are described in oral and written history. We acknowledge that the original and official language of this territory is Anishinaabemowin. That the revitalization of the Anishinaabemowin language here will be our priority. The Anishinaabemowin language possesses the history, governance, and laws that preceded here upon this territory. We acknowledge that the Anishinaabemowin language that was spoken here was derived from the sound of this territory, and that it will be spoken and heard with the utmost respect. Finally, we acknowledge that we will strive to return this land to its original order. The order described and held language, the stories, and the teachings of this land. Endeavor to original protectors, the Anishinaabe. And I put that together and I filled that full of Indigenous understanding about the territory and the land that was filled with creation teachings, not to give everything away, but a respectful English written acknowledgement. And the more that we say that, we begin to engage. And I think that it's important that particularly here in Treaty 29, the treaty had a de-escalation clause. So the less and less Indigenous people were here, the more land could be taken away. But there was never an opposite clause where the more Indigenous people, the more land could be given back. And I say that we should strive to actualize some of the predetermined laws. And I was asked once by a PhD candidate maybe 15, 20 years ago, if I could change anything in the education system, what would it be? And I said, I would make sure that every race every walk of mankind could hear our creation story, because our creation story puts the earth, it puts every living being ahead of mankind. If we could have that, we'd stand a chance at saving this planet. That's what I mean by restoring the original order to this territory. Hope that helps answer that question.
That was a great answer, Chief, and thanks, Deborah, for that. We have another question or comment from Jolene DeGurse McDonald. I would love to play a recording of that in my NBV class. Is it available? Is there a recording of it? So, I mean, there you go, Chief.
I'll make a recording. I'll make a recording and I'll forward that to Dallas.
That sounds great.
Shared. Is that okay?
Perfect. Okay, Chief, we have another from Janet. Bonjour, Jason. I'm from Umjanong and work in one of the LKDSB schools. Can you hear me, Jason? Are we all set?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep. Just
okay.
Yep.
Bonjour, Jason. I'm from Umjanong and work in one of the LKDSB schools. I have struggles with land acknowledgement as well. The students hear it day after day and not really hearing it anymore. I have been in my classrooms and asked exactly, whose land are you acknowledging? Where are you people living currently? They have no idea. Is it time for it to be rewritten? And that's from Janet.
That was part of my daughter's problem as a student, is that she didn't feel that the land acknowledgements were, I mean, it was just for her as a language learner, as a 14-year-old, she was hurt by the bastardization of our language, but also the fact that it's like, okay, let's check this box this morning and say the land acknowledgement. That's why I try to apply meaning to that land acknowledgement that I put together last week. And in response to her concerns that day, which she is concerned about every day, I guess, but she was really upset that day that she was just a bad day for her, like as a learner in the system. So I think you're right that it is time to relook at that and reevaluate that and talk about the territory, right, in a meaningful fashion and to acknowledge what that means. And I think it's important. I know that there's Treaty Week, and I know there's this slogan that we're all treaty people, but we really need to understand that is that the treaties are, and as elected chief, I have just as much entitlement as a treaty person as any other citizen as a rights and title holder in our community, because the chief and council in the community, like Kettle Point and Stony Point and Umjanong and Wapul, those are Indian Act corporations, right? They're an instrument of the Indian Act, but as treaty signatories, we were sovereign nations recognized by other sovereign nations. When we talk about the territory that we're acknowledging, we're talking about the entire continent, number one. And then when you get down to the brass tacks of it, then maybe you could break it down to the actual treaty areas. And in this area, we're basically within the Huron Tract Treaty, the treaty number 29, which was signed in 1827. It took 14 years to negotiate that treaty, by the way. So I have that question all the time for people as well. What land are you talking about?
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Chief. You know, when that land acknowledgement was created, there was a lot of consultation between the different partners of the First Nations. And as sitting as the ILC table, the Indigenous Liaison table, that has a lot of administrators and superintendents and trustees and chairs of the board, consulting with First Nations and in the education departments, and there's a lot of people that had a hand in with creating the land acknowledgement. I honestly, as an Indigenous lead, you know, the previous lead had a lot of work involved with that, you know, and I think that, you know, maybe it is time, and maybe that question is something that we can pose at the next meeting, Janet, because It's really up to all the nations together, as you know, speaking on behalf of LKDSB on an Indigenous side, you know, maybe it's something that we should look at and get some answers from the nations. But great question, Janet. And let me see. Jolene has another question, Chief. As a part of my morning routine, after the LKDSB Land Acknowledgement and the Colonizers Anthem, O Canada, I find some Indigenous music, like flute music. And then in the afternoon, I try to play contemporary music. I've been told by some that this is an appropriation and not actually appreciation. How do you feel about that? I am teaching an Indigenous studies course.
You know, can you imagine all the great comments that were lost when people were on mute and on Zoom over the last year? I started talking when I was on mute there. That's a good question. And I know it's a struggle nowadays on what's appreciation, what's respect, and what's appropriation. I know that becomes a struggle when you consider like the, you know, the sports teams, mascots, and things like that. And in the context of sharing music to create awareness and understanding, and we talked about culture, right? And music is very much about culture, right? Like the music of today expresses the culture and some of the feelings and that, and the current status of Indigenous people. So I think that's important, and I don't necessarily think that it's appropriation, as long as like you bring the understanding when you share that I'm sharing this music to bring reference and respect to where that artist is coming from. And I've talked about this previously, you know, we have our own anthems, you know, as Indigenous people, right? And I've talked about this years ago, and I'd still like to see it, that there, it doesn't have to be each and every day, but on some days it would be great to hear our Anishinaabe flag songs, which are our anthems, which honor the nations that were originally here, and that honor the Eagle staffs and those teachings and that governance structure that was here, pre-colonization. And it'd be great to have those and talk about them, right? And form it up ahead of time. And we're talking about culture shock, and I'm just going to take a minute to touch base on that. And I'm very proud of my culture and my identity, and so are my kids. And my daughter was so upset with just the bastardization of our people names, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. I go absolutely nuts when I go in and share in classrooms. And I haven't done it in over a year because you guys have been closed, everyone's been closed. But when people mock or make fun of our singing, and I would hate for one of our students to have to sit in the classroom though, while someone like Dallas shared the flag song, or it was played over recording, and the other non-Indigenous students mocked or made fun of that singing. That, if somebody made fun of O Canada or the Star Spangled Banner, it would be a tragedy. They could be suspended for that, likely. I would hate for that to ever happen to one of our songs. It hurts my feelings as an Indigenous person. I can't imagine what our kids would feel like to have to sit through that. And I know some of them have. I know some of them have sat through different sessions in classes and been sort of laughed at and mocked. So I'm cautious about that as well. So I don't think that's appropriation. I think that if it's done in the proper way, with the proper explanation and the follow-up after that, that it's appropriate, as long as it's done with caution. But I would hate to create an environment where Indigenous identity and culture could be mocked or made fun of. My kids, each and every one of them, experience racism from teachers, right? Every one of them. I know I did for sure, but my kids still today, like maybe a week or two ago, my daughter's like, or my son was like, yeah, at Lambton College, the teacher said, hey, we got to go have a powwow and sort this out. And he took offense to that, right? You know, my daughter hears the same kind of stories. we're gonna powwow about this. And my daughter's like, well, geez, I didn't bring my dress, like, you know, and who's the drum? Like, who's coming, right? Like, are we gonna ceremony? Like, what are you talking about? Or do you mean powwow, like you want to sit around and create some kind of tension in the room, right? Like, I just want to be cautious about that. Thank you for your question, though, and I know I'm at my time limit, but I just wanted to thank you for that question. I think it starts a great dialogue about what's appropriate and what's appropriation.
You know what, we could go on and on, Chief, you know, and it's funny because our non-Indigenous friends, they don't realize when we talk, we get right into a million different directions. But I agree, you know, like we had an event on the last year for Solidarity Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, and our flag song would turn into an old Black Lodge flag song. And it was just great. Everybody loved it. So I totally agree with you on that. I want to say thank you to all the educators that showed up tonight and listened to our Ogima speak on behalf of our students and his experience and his family. He's a very kind man, and I vouch for him any day of my life as a family member and as a community member. And so I really appreciate Chief coming on and addressing our school board and everybody that showed up. Great time, great discussion, and yeah, that's a wrap for tonight. And if there's any other questions for you educators and you want to ask, you can reach out to myself, Gretchen Sands, or Jawin Shugnosh, and we can ask Chief more questions and we'll get those answers for you. But Chimigwech Ugima and Bamon Piminwa.
Hey, Chimigwech, Bamampi.